Thank you so much, Rabbi Rapport. It's beautiful being in a service led by you with Joyce Rosenzweig and Sam Rosen. So moving. Thank you so much for this beautiful service tonight. And I'm curious to know, and folks should put in the chat, who thinks they're going to want to come to a service together with us next week or the week after? Are you feeling anxious about being in the sanctuary together? Are you looking forward to it? Are you going to stay on Zoom even if you're here in New York City? Let us know what you're thinking. So this Shabbat, which is the Shabbat of the beginning, the first Shabbat of the month of Tammuz, it is the second Shabbat of the month of June, which is Pride Month. It is the Shabbat of Parshat Shlach Lecha, and is the Shabbat of the B'not Mitzvah of two of our beloved CBS team members. It is also really, since next Shabbat we are going back to the sanctuary, although not for every week, it is really the end of a certain stage of our life as a community. We will be back next week with congregants in the sanctuary creating prayer together. But we're not going to be the same that we were. We're not just turning a switch and going back to March of 2020. We're different. Our community is going to be more conscious that we are both in the sanctuary and Zooming or streaming in. And there are so many ways that we've been transformed, changed, affected by these 15 months. The world is full of perspectives that are thrown at us in social media and in TV commentary and newspapers and punditry. We mark this Shabbat, which is the Shabbat of June 12th, the 5th anniversary of the massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Florida. I was so moved to read in the last couple of days that the Congress of the United States has voted, both houses have voted to make the Pulse, that nightclub, into a national memorial. How moving that we've arrived at a moment in history that we have a House of Representatives and a Senate that understand the depth of tragedy that was found that 5 years ago. It was on June 12th, but that June 12th was also Shavuot that year, for those of us who remember so well, coming in that Shavuot morning, learning this news of the massacre of 49 LGBT, mostly Latinx young people, out to have a good time, to dance, to party, to be able to embrace an identity as LGBT in a moment of joy and celebration. For that moment to be transformed into a massacre, hatred, combined with easy access to guns that this country is obsessed with, turned that night of Shavuot, a night of revelation, into a night of tragedy and sadness and mourning and loss. Tomorrow there's going to be an observance by the New York group Gays Against Guns, which in many ways was born at CBST, and we're so proud of our CBST member Shep Wannen, who represents us at the GAG group, which does such fantastic demonstrations and vigils and rallies to try and do something about the evil of guns in this country. So on this Shabbat of Pride Month, we remember the tragedies that are involved, that we have absorbed as an LGBT community. And I'm a little stunned at the fact that we have a government actually at this stage which is ready to recognize that this is a national tragedy that must be mourned as a people, not just a tragedy of those of us who are LGBTQ. This week's Parsha, Korach, will be spoken about quite interestingly and movingly by our B'not Mitzvah tomorrow morning. And I urge you to come to hear their words and their exploration of what the story of Korach means. Last week's Parsha, Shlach Lecha, has a story in it I want to refer to tonight. And I read from the Parsha itself as it sets up the story of Korach, which we'll study more tomorrow. It's the story of the Meraglim, famously the spies, that Moses sends into the land to come back and tell those who have not yet arrived at the promised land what's to be expected. It's the classic story of asking for news about what the future will be. And it's the classic story of the different ways that news can be observed, recorded, and then reported. So for those who don't know, Moshe sends these 12 Meraglim, these 12 spies into the land to come back and to give a report to the people. There are many, many ways to study this story. What was Moshe's intent exactly? If Moshe knew it in advance himself, what was Moshe looking for? He sent leaders of the community. Was it trying to build a certain kind of buy-in where you ask others to be able to be reinforcers of the story that you want to tell? So you send others in to come back. What was the motivation of the Holy One, of God, at this moment in the story, to not just tell us the future was going to be okay, but to ask for leaders to go and come back and report on what they would see? I'm going to leave the issue of motivation behind and ask the story this question. Did the Meraglim who went and returned, did they function as purveyors of fake news, which we know so well? Or were they telling the truth in their report? Do we, in the world in which we live, suffer from only fake news, actually lies about the reality in which we live, or also suffer from the truth? The Meraglim come back. 12 were sent out, including Caleb and Joshua. And of the 12, you might well know the story, 10 reported the following. The 10 who came back and said, "We cannot overcome the people. We will not be able to survive if we enter the land. All the people that we saw there are giants," they said. They are B'nai Anak, Minan Niflim. They are huge. They are so powerful. There will be no way that we can overcome them. And then they famously say, Vanhi, and we, ve'enenu, in our eyes, next to them, ve'enenu, in our eyes, we looked like grasshoppers. V'chein hayinu ve'enehem. And so we looked that way to them. So the Mefarshim spent a lot of time asking the question, well, what was so wrong with what the initial 10 reported? In many ways, they were not telling or spreading fake news. They were telling on some level the truth. The truth was the going was going to be very difficult. The mountains that needed to be overcome for a future worth living were enormous. The obstacles were tremendous. The difficulties could not be overstated. But the part that the Mefarshim point to as being the fake news part of the story is what the conclusion was that the Meraglim drew from the facts as they saw them. That the future to the Meraglim was full of great and grave and serious difficulties that looked to the naked eye as insurmountable, intractable, absolutely intractable problems. But what was fake news that the Mefarshim tell us? They don't use the word fake news, but we see that way. Their conclusion is that against the obstacles, we are insignificant, we are insufficient, we don't have the strength, we don't have the imagination, we don't have the abilities to overcome, and therefore, the Meraglim said, we see ourselves as insignificant, as insufficient, as too weak to overcome the obstacles. The two others of the 12, Caleb and Joshua said, no, we will be able to overcome the obstacles. It is a land full of nourishment, of milk and of honey. The obstacles are great. They agreed on those facts. They disagreed on the fact that we are insignificant, and so we're like grasshoppers. We're tiny. We're weak compared to the obstacles that we face. And so the Mefarshim show us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, understands that the two who came back with the report, not to disagree with the facts, but they came back with hope and aspiration and strength and encouragement, those two were destined to be the leaders of our people. And the 10 who had gone, and they were big shots, by the way, we're told by the text and the Mefarshim, they were leaders of the tribes. Those 10 were not what leaders should be. And they disappear from the story, and Caleb and Joshua become the leaders of our people. This is what we need from leadership. We need people who could look at obstacles and at difficulties and at seemingly insurmountable, intractable problems. And what distinguishes leaders from the others are those like Caleb and Joshua who could say, we shall overcome those obstacles. We are able to embrace the difficulties and not be defeated. We are not insignificant. We are not insufficient. And in these days of fake news and of fear-mongering, this is exactly what we need to do. Yes, there are those like the killer who went into the Pulse nightclub and killed 49 of us. Yes, there are those who are expressing anti-Semitism in these days in horrific ways. The ADL indicates since the conflict with Hamas and Israel and the terrible events of those times, 75% increase in anti-Semitic assaults, verbal attacks, and social media. I read from one story that was in the news. Alex Zeldin, a frum guy on the Upper West Side, was headed to Trader Joe's on New York City's Upper West Side to pick up some food for Shabbat. As usual, he was wearing his yarmulke. When he turned a corner, he realized that a couple of teenagers had started to follow him, spewing anti-Semitic insults. It took me about halfway down the block to realize that the thing that they were commenting on, they kept saying yarmulke. I want to take that yarmulke. I want to hit this guy in the head and take his yarmulke. That Jewish baby killer with the yarmulke. They ultimately peeled off, but he was terrified. There was an attack on this 29-year-old man. In Los Angeles, 5 people suffered minor injuries after they were attacked by people who were waving Palestinian flags. In Tucson, Arizona, a synagogue was vandalized. In London, Ontario, this week, a driver deliberately ran his car into a family of Muslims, killing them deliberately as they were out for a walk on a nice day. Killing a mother, a father, a daughter, and a grandmother, leaving the only survivor, a 9-year-old shy boy who had to wake up in the hospital to be told his entire family was killed by a murderer out to kill Muslims walking in the street. The Afzal Salman family, devastated by this Islamophobic, violent hater using his car as a weapon. We are afraid of the increased violence that is in the language and in the actions in the world around us. It is confusing to confront the world in which we live. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel or its policies. Of that I am absolutely sure. But I am also sure that there are those who use criticism of Israel in order to embolden, encourage, and increase anti-Semitism in the world, both things are true? How do we hold these multiple realities at once? What are the reports that we are listening to from the Meraglim, from the spies, from those who bring us reports? How do we listen to the news from Israel and from Palestine? How do we not get torn up inside and feel the need to immediately criticize or condemn? How do we find a way to bring back vision of the possibility of overcoming the violence of the time in which we live? We must listen to those who tell us it is possible to overcome. It is possible to defeat hate with love. It is possible to defeat the gun scourge in this country. It is possible to overcome the hatred between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And it is possible to believe in the possibilities of peace in the world. It is not about realism alone, because the first 10 of those Meraglim were also realistic, you could argue. You could argue that they were telling the truth. But what we need is the constant reinforcement of hope. To remember that there are Palestinians, there are Israeli Jews who not only dream of a shared society built on justice and peace, but act in ways every day to bring us closer. We must believe in the possibilities of standing up against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism, and not be condemned to a life in which we just feel overwhelmed by the hatred and violence in the world. It is not just about what is actually true and real. It is what is the kavanah? How will we reinforce the muscles that we all must develop of hope and of belief in a future worth living? We must do it in the name of those 49 young people, mostly, who died at the Pulse nightclub. We must do it in the name of that Muslim family in London, Ontario, who died as an act of violence. We must do it in the name of every Jew who experiences anti-Semitism. We must understand that our job, like Joshua and Caleb, is to be voices of hope and optimism and inspiration. And we never know if it will be in our time that we will reach this promised land. But we do know that without building that foundation of hope and of optimism and of love and of non-violence, without that we will never achieve it. And we must hand to our young people a deep belief in our identity as Jews, that continually, I will say, that the strongest response to anti-Semitism is to strengthen our Jewish communities of value, to give in money and in time to communities like CBST and organizations that are making Jewish life strong and vital, and to know that we invest in our young people, like Risa and like Dory, a hope that the future is worth living for, and that love and peace and gentleness and civility are values that no matter how other people behave, we will embrace. We are told that the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred among Jews. We will be sources of ahavat chinam, of baseless love, in order to counter that. This morning at the Kotel for Rosh Chodesh, Haredi young men and women attacked the women of the wall who are trying to daven from a Sefer Torah, from the Siddur. They took the Siddurim and ripped the pages of the Siddur and trampled the pages, as the women in these most powerful videos, very quietly but firmly, picked up those pieces of the Siddur on the floor, kissed them, and took them away from the violence. The hatred we experience is outside of the Jewish people and towards the Jewish people. It's inside of our people. It's in all different places. We will only respond to that hatred with love, with firm and consistent love. We will overcome the most intractable, most insurmountable obstacles in front of us. The Meraglim tell us the cost of not doing that. So we, together, I ask you to join me in remaining full of hope, of exercising the muscles of hope and of peace and of love, and to give that to our next generation as our legacy. And maybe, in many, many, many years from now, they will look back on us and they will remember that we did not give up. Ani ma'amin, we believe with full faith in the coming of a redeemed world. And even if that time shall wait, and even if it should be very delayed, every single day we will believe in that possibility. I believe that as a lesbian. I believe it as a Jew. I believe it as a New Yorker. I believe it as an American citizen. I believe it as a human being. Shabbat Shalom. Blessings, blessings to all.